No one speaks. They barely breathe. Every man knows the moment before the attack is the most fragile, when advantage hangs by a thread. One wrong sound, one glimmer of reflection, one careless change in course, and the predator becomes the hunted. The captain whispers coordinates. Torpedo crews lock mechanisms into place. Depth controls adjust. The U-boat rises to periscope depth with the patience of a stalking wolf, confident in the cloak of night. For now, they believe the ocean belongs to them. That belief is about to end. The German Navy entered the Second World War with a disadvantage it had not fully escaped since the end of the First. The Treaty of Versailles had choked the Kriegsmarine's growth, restricting the size of its fleet, limiting battleship construction, and suppressing naval ambition. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel, like it, spread the word, and tell us where you're watching from. Germany could not match the Royal Navy ship for ship. It could not hope to dominate the Atlantic with surface fleets the way Britain historically had. But inside this limitation was the seed of a new strategy, one built beneath the waves. Karl Dönitz, a former submarine officer during World War I, understood the ocean differently. He believed that power did not have to be seen to be decisive. Dönitz envisioned a navy that struck from invisibility, packs of submarines operating in coordinated formations across vast stretches of open ocean. He called it Rudeltaktik, Wolfpack Doctrine, and in the early years of the war, it was devastating. At night, under cover of darkness, U-boats surfaced to attack. On the surface, they moved faster, spotted better, and struck with surprise. Convoys crossing the North Atlantic, the supply lifeline between the United States and Britain, were slow, heavily loaded, and often thinly guarded. Allied escorts were few in number and technologically behind. Radar was primitive, sonar limited, and aircraft range insufficient to patrol the mid-Atlantic gap, a deadly void where no aircraft could reach, leaving convoys exposed. It was here, in endless rolling swells and freezing winds, that the U-boats hunted. The ocean became a battlefield without borders. Ships did not see their attackers. Crews rarely heard a warning. A torpedo could end hundreds of lives in seconds. Flames, splintered steel, and the roar of breaking hulls became the soundtrack of the Atlantic night. In 1940 and 1941, the U-boats' success grew at an alarming pace. Merchant ships went down in staggering numbers. Tankers burned. Cargo of grain, ammunition, airplane parts, medicine all sank to the bottom of the ocean, leaving Britain struggling to feed itself. London estimated that if losses continued at this rate, the nation would starve long before the Wehrmacht ever landed on English soil. Convoys attempted to adapt. Escorts zigzagged courses to throw off torpedo targeting. They carried depth charges and hydrophones to listen for submarine engines. They maintained blackout conditions to hide silhouettes on the horizon, but the advantage still lay with the hunters. A U-boat could wait submerged for hours. It could track at distance. It could strike at the moment of weakest defense, typically just before dawn or deep in the darkest part of night. Merchant sailors knew this. Every dusk brought dread. Every ripple on black water felt like threat. The strategy worked because of speed of communication. German U-boats communicated through encrypted signals using the Enigma machine. Dönitz could coordinate dozens of submarines at once, directing them toward convoys detected by submarines or reconnaissance aircraft. When one U-boat found prey, others closed in. The convoy would find itself surrounded, unseen enemies closing in from every direction. U-boat crews believed they were part of something unstoppable. They saw themselves as silent guardians of their nation's future. Their victories were broadcast in German newspapers. Their captains became national heroes. The Wolfpack was more than a tactic. It was psychological warfare. It made the Allies fear the sea itself. The Atlantic, once a route of movement and trade, became a graveyard. Shipwrecks littered the ocean floor. Sailors clung to rafts in icy water, praying for rescue that often never came. For Britain, every lost convoy was more than numbers. It was survival slipping away. The question was not whether U-boats were winning. The question was whether they could be stopped before the war turned irrevocably in Germany's favor. And yet, under the surface of strategy and steel, Another race had already begun, one not fought with torpedoes or convoys, but with mathematics, physics, and radio waves. The balance of the Atlantic would not be changed at sea, but in laboratories, factories, and hidden research facilities far from the roar of the ocean. A new kind of vision was coming to the waves. A way to see the invisible. A way to turn hunters into prey. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the scale of the Atlantic struggle shifted. American shipyards accelerated production at a rate no Axis nation could match. Liberty ships and new destroyer escorts began sliding off assembly lines faster than U-boats could sink them, but numbers alone were not enough. The wolf packs were aggressive, experienced, and still held tactical advantage, particularly in the mid-ocean gap. Britain, strained nearly to breaking, desperately needed a technological edge, and it was here that science and warfare converged. British researchers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had been exploring new radar frequencies, shorter wavelength systems capable of detecting small objects on the water's surface. Meanwhile, American industry had resources and manufacturing power capable of scaling experimental systems into battlefield assets. The partnership was uneasy, but necessary. Early radar sets struggled in rough seas. U-boats that traveled surfaced at night remained all but invisible, yet teams persisted, trial after trial, prototype after prototype. At the same time, Allied intelligence improved radio interception through HFDF, high-frequency direction finding, which allowed escort ships to triangulate U-boat message transmissions. It was not perfect, but it began to chip away at the Wolfpack's invisibility. The race was not only technological, it was existential. If convoys continued to fall, Britain could collapse. If Britain collapsed, the United States would stand alone. The Atlantic was the artery of Allied survival, and the hunters prowled freely in its darkest waters. But soon, the darkness would be pierced. Because a new radar, compact, precise, and deadly accurate, was about to move from testing rooms to convoy decks. A technology the U-boats were never prepared for. And once it arrived, the ocean itself would change. Life aboard a U-boat was not the triumphant image portrayed in propaganda posters or wartime speeches. It was claustrophobic, damp, and suffocating. Space was so limited that bunks were shared, slept in shifts, and wedged between torpedoes and machinery. Fresh water was rationed, shaving was rare, clothes remained soaked in salt and diesel fumes. The air was thick with humidity and carbon dioxide, especially after days submerged. Metal sweated, walls dripped. Every creak, every pressure change reminded the crew how thin the boundary was between life and a crushing death under thousands of tons of seawater. Crewmen lived in a world of routine and sudden terror. Hours of stillness could be shattered by a single sonar ping. A depth charge run could last minutes or hours or an entire day, explosions hammering the hull, lights flickering, bolts shivering, fear tightening in the throat. Bodies trembled not from cold, but from the knowledge that any strike strong enough could rupture steel, flood compartments, and drown them all. Yet despite the danger, camaraderie ran deep. They trusted one another. They trusted their captain. They believed their mission mattered. Those missions took advantage of a tactic that weaponized silence, speed, and coordination. The Wolfpack. A single U-boat rarely attacked alone when the stakes were high. Instead, once a convoy was spotted, a message was sent, encrypted through the Enigma machine, to headquarters. Dernets operating from land would direct nearby submarines to converge. The Wolfpack gathered, unseen and unheard, trailing the convoy like shadows moving across an empty ocean. Then the attack came at night. At night, U-boats surfaced to run on diesel engines, which allowed them to move faster than most escorts. On the surface, they could see ships' silhouettes, their outlines faint against starlight or moon glow. Torpedoes were fired from close range, often within a few hundred meters. A merchant ship struck in the bow or amidships could break apart in minutes. Fire would crawl across spilled oil. Sailors scrambled in chaos. Some leapt into freezing water without life jackets. Shockwaves rolled across the conv. As alarms rang and escort ships broke formations searching for attackers they could not see. For the Allied merchant marine, the losses were more than strategic. They were deeply human. Crews were largely civilian. Many had never seen combat. They hauled grain, fuel, weapons, and mail, supplies meant to keep nations alive. They worked long hours under harsh conditions, only to face an enemy they could not detect or prepare for. Records from survivors describe nights where torpedoes struck so suddenly that some men awoke already in the water or trapped below deck. Over 30,000 merchant sailors would die in the Battle of the Atlantic, a casualty rate higher than that of many frontline armies. And yet, as the U-boats hunted with confidence, something was quietly changing across the ocean, something no submarine crew could yet feel. A new form of detection was moving into the sky. A technology that would give the hunters an enemy they had never expected. The United States had the industrial capacity to build ships, weapons, and aircraft in enormous numbers, but quantity alone could not solve the submarine problem. The ocean was simply too vast, and the U-boats too elusive. What the Allies needed was a way to see in the dark, to detect a submarine before it struck, to locate it not by sound or silhouette, but by something deeper, more precise. This led to one of the most significant scientific advancements of the war: centimetric radar. Early radar systems used long wavelengths that bounced poorly off small, low-profile objects like a submarine conning tower. U-boats traveling on the surface at night could appear invisible, lost within sea clutter and background noise. But researchers in Britain, working with American engineers and industrial manufacturers, developed shorter wavelength radar that could detect small shapes even at long distances. The device that made this possible was the cavity magnetron, a compact, powerful radar transmitter. Once the United States began mass-producing it, the technology could be installed on airplanes, escort ships, and even small patrol craft. Aircraft equipped with this new radar could now patrol the mid-Atlantic gap, once the safe haven of the U-boats. A submarine on the surface at night, previously protected by darkness, could now be detected from miles away without warning. By the time the U-boats saw the aircraft's spotlight cut through the night, depth charges were already falling. But radar was only part of the shift. HFDF radio direction, finding nicknamed Huff Duff, allowed Allied ships to triangulate the origin of U-boat radio messages. Every time a submarine contacted headquarters or signaled another boat, a small piece of its position was revealed. The Wolf Pack, once coordinated with deadly precision, found its own communication becoming a vulnerability. Meanwhile, Germany struggled with industrial pressure. U-boat construction increased, but morale and training quality declined. Crews were younger, less experienced. Replacement boats rolled out too slowly to match losses. Supply chains tightened. Oil reserves strained. And as Allied air superiority grew over both land and sea, German shipyards faced bombing raids that slowed output and crippled infrastructure. Confidence, once the psychological backbone of the U-boat fleet, began to erode. Reports from patrols described sightings of aircraft where none had ever appeared before. Night attacks grew dangerous. Captains hesitated to surface for too long. The very tactic that made U-boats effective, nighttime surface assaults, had become a liability. The hunters were beginning to feel panic. Something had changed in the Atlantic. The shadows were no longer safe. And soon, the turning point would strike with unmistakable clarity when radar fully met the Wolfpack on open water. The shift began quietly, not with a grand announcement, but with equipment crates loaded onto ships leaving American harbors in early 1943. Inside those crates was the 10-centimeter wavelength centimetric radar, powered by the cavity magnetron. Unlike earlier radar models that struggled to pick up small objects on the surface of rough seas, this new system could detect the narrow silhouette of a submarine even when only the periscope or conning tower broke the waterline. Its introduction onto escort carriers, destroyer escorts, and long-range patrol aircraft marked the beginning of a new phase in the Battle of the Atlantic. The U-boats didn't know it at first. How could they? They had always relied on darkness as their greatest ally. Night was their shield, the moment when they traveled surfaced, recharging batteries, airing out the boat, launching attacks under the cover of invisibility. Convoys slept uneasily knowing predators circled unseen. For years, this pattern had remained constant. But now there were eyes in the night sky. The first convoy commanders equipped with centimetric radar noticed something startling. Targets appeared clearly even in pitch darkness. A submarine moving at night, once invisible at a distance of a few hundred meters, could now be detected at several miles, silently, without searchlights, without flares. The escorts didn't have to reveal themselves. They only needed to close distance and strike. On March 10, 1943, a Royal Navy destroyer outfitted with the new radar detected a U-boat at night, approaching a convoy under full stealth. The destroyer closed in at high speed. The U-boat's watch crew had no warning, no engine noise heard, no silhouettes sighted. Only when star shells burst overhead, illuminating the sea like flickering lightning, did the submarine crew understand. The ocean was no longer dark. Depth charges fell in rapid succession, exploding around the hull. The U-boat attempted an emergency dive, but the destroyer tracked its movements seamlessly. Sonar maintained contact. The pressure rose, steel groaned, and then the hull gave way. News of the sinking reached Donitz's command center, but it was not yet viewed as a pattern, merely the cost of war. U-boats were expected to be lost. The Wolfpack doctrine continued. But over the next weeks, reports accumulated. Night surface attacks failed. U-boats were detected at unprecedented distances. Convoys that should have been easy targets now slipped through untouched. And the most unsettling detail: the Allied ships were finding the U-boats, not the other way around. The Atlantic began to change hands without a single formal declaration. It wasn't a visible battle line nor a dramatic naval confrontation. It was a shift in information, a shift in perception, a shift in who could see and who could not. The hunters were being seen before they could strike. They were being attacked before they could retreat. And the wolfpacks, once coordinated and confident, found themselves isolated, hunted by enemies that appeared from the night sky without warning. The balance of power had tipped. But the true shock, the moment that broke the myth of U-boat invincibility, was still to come. The spring and summer of 1943 became the defining period. Convoys HX-239 and SC-130 were among the first to operate under full radar air escort integration. Escort carriers such as USS Bog and HMS Archer launched aircraft that patrolled day and night, radar sweeping the ocean like an invisible spotlight. What followed was the most rapid reversal of naval fortune in the entire war. U-boats caught on the surface had no time to react. Aircraft dove without warning. Depth charges and rockets slammed into the water before the submarine crew could reach diving depth. Submerged, they were slow and blind. Surfaced, they were exposed and trackable. The tactical equation that had sustained the Wolfpacks no longer worked. In May 1943 alone, the Germans lost 41 U-boats, more than in any previous month of the war. Dönitz recognized the pattern with brutal clarity. The Atlantic was no longer the hunting ground of the U-boat. It had become a killing field. He wrote in a communication to High Command, "We are facing a weapon against which we have no defense." The phrase spread quietly through the U-boat arm. It was not publicly spoken, not officially acknowledged, but it lived in the silence between officers, in the way captains hesitated before surfacing at night. The invincible hunter myth had cracked. German engineers scrambled to respond. Radar detectors such as the Metox and later Naxos were rushed into service, devices designed to pick up radar emissions before the submarine was detected. But centimetric radar was too precise, too fast, and too flexible, and Allied scientists moved faster than German countermeasures could be fielded. The psychological toll was immediate. Crews reported seeing aircraft appear from the darkness, as if materializing out of the air itself. Men began to fear night surfacing, the act essential to their survival. Submarine commanders wrote in logs that the sea had become haunted. Others described the radar as the invisible enemy. The strategic repercussions rippled outward. Convoys that once lost 5, 10, or more ships in a single crossing now reached Britain largely intact. Supplies surged, factories ran, cities lit, civilian morale stabilized. The possibility of Allied defeat in the Atlantic, once a genuine threat, vanished almost overnight. The Battle of the Atlantic had reached its decisive turning point. And for the first time since the war began, the U-boat crews realized something they had never imagined possible. They were no longer the predators. They were the prey. The stage was set for the aftermath, a collapse not only measured in steel and ships, but in hope, confidence, and the identity of the men who once ruled the deep. By the summer of 1943, the collapse of the U-boat campaign was undeniable. The Battle of the Atlantic had swung decisively against Germany. Losses mounted at a pace no fleet, no matter how disciplined or devoted, could sustain. Patrol after patrol failed to return. Crews once celebrated as national heroes disappeared without message, without signal, without trace, swallowed by the same ocean they had once roamed with confidence. Karl Dönitz, now Grand Admiral, studied the reports in grim silence. The statistics were stark. In 1942, U-boats had been sinking Allied shipping faster than it could be replaced, but by mid-1943, that ratio reversed. The Allies' shipbuilding efforts surged ahead, while U-boat losses soared. More boats were being destroyed each month than Germany could produce. And critically, the quality of new crews declined. Veterans were gone. Trainees replaced them, younger, less experienced, lacking the instinctive feel for silence, depth, and survival that defined the first generation of U-boat sailors. Dönitz made a decision he had once considered unthinkable. He ordered many U-boats to return to port, not in retreat but in preservation. If they continued to operate under existing conditions, the U-boat arm might cease to exist entirely. The wolf pack had lost the night. It had lost the surface. It had lost the sky above and the sea around. It was no longer a weapon, it was a target. Meanwhile, the convoys transformed. Ships once scattered across the ocean now moved with confidence. Escort carriers patrolled overhead, long-range aircraft scanned the waves, destroyers ran sonar sweeps, and radar-equipped escorts guarded flanks with precision. Where panic had once lived, procedure now ruled. The numbers told the story. In early 1942, Allied shipping losses had exceeded 650,000 tons per month. By late 1943, losses dropped to less than 100,000 tons, often far lower. By 1944, U-boats were sinking almost nothing of strategic value. The lifeline between North America and Britain, once stretched thin and near breaking, now strengthened each day. Food, weapons, fuel, vehicles, and troops crossed the Atlantic in record volume. The stage was set for operations on a scale the Axis could no longer match, including the invasion of Normandy. But behind the statistics were lives, thousands of them. The human cost of the U-boat war was unlike any other branch of service. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served aboard German submarines during the war, over 28,000 were killed. More than 70%, the highest fatality rate of any major combat force in the entire conflict. Most died without burial, their bodies entombed in steel hulls resting silent on the seafloor. And yet the sea did not cheer. It did not choose sides. It simply returned to being what it had always been, vast, indifferent, and waiting. The war, however, was not finished. Its consequences would continue to shape the lives of those who survived, above and below the surface. The collapse of the U-boat campaign reshaped Germany's naval identity. The men who returned from patrol brought with them stories not of triumph, but of endurance, days spent submerged to avoid patrol aircraft, weeks without surfacing due to radar sweeps, constant fear the moment they climbed to periscope depth. They were no longer hunters. They were fugitives in the very ocean they once dominated. Dönitz tried to restore effectiveness by introducing new U-boat models, particularly the Type XXI Electroboot, a revolutionary submarine capable of staying submerged longer and traveling faster underwater than on the surface. Had it been available earlier, it might have changed the war's course. But it arrived too late. Production delays, Allied bombing raids, and Germany's collapsing supply chain meant the new submarines never deployed in numbers large enough to matter. The war had moved beyond the point where innovation alone could reverse its trajectory. Meanwhile, Allied shipping lanes grew into armadas. Troops crossed the Atlantic by the hundreds of thousands. Tanks, aircraft, landing craft, and entire logistical networks were transporting without catastrophic loss. The success of the radar campaign made the invasion of Normandy logistically possible. Without secure Atlantic supply routes, the Allies could not have opened the Western Front. Merchant sailors, the civilian backbone of the convoys, carried scars of the years of silent terror. Some never spoke of what they saw: ships breaking apart in flames, frozen bodies drifting in black water, rafts overturned by waves. Their contribution rarely received the glory given to infantry or airmen, yet without them the war would have been unwinnable. They were the lifeline. They kept Britain alive. They kept armies moving. For the families of U-boat crews, closure rarely came. There were no marked grave, no wrecks retrieved, no bodies returned home. Letters stopped arriving. Silence replaced certainty. Mothers, wives, and children understood what silence meant. Germany built monuments later, long after the war ended, simple stone markers, engraved with names of men whose final resting places are the cold, dark seabed. The Battle of the Atlantic remains one of the longest continuous campaigns in military history. It was not defined by a single decisive battle, but by the slow, grinding shift of advantage from stealth and fear to detection and coordination. It was a technological war as much as a naval one, and when radar pierced the darkness, everything changed. The ocean still holds the wrecks, quiet, undisturbed, preserved in saltwater silence. Their story does not end beneath the waves. It continues in what came after, not just in victory, but in reflection. Which leads us to the final question.